Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard. Ben DuBose here, Paulo, Alves there. Welcome back to another episode of The Lager Line, served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. This is the show where we talk all things Houston Rockets basketball. Of course, I'm your host, Ben. I'm the editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of the team. Back with us is our usual co-host and producer, Paulo Alves, out of Portugal. You can follow him on Twitter /X at Paulo Alves NBA. Me on there simply at Ben DuBose. We had a couple of mini episodes last week without Paulo, who was dealing with a few personal issues, but he's back for the first time since the end of August. And Paulo, the last time we recorded, it was 2 weeks ago. And we actually thought we'd be scrambling for content in September because usually that's the dead period on the NBA calendar leading up to training camp. Players and staffers around the league are going on vacation, not doing a whole lot. Yeah, it's not a dead period for the Houston Rockets. There's a lot that's happened since we last talked, right?
Yeah, and it's not exactly for a positive reason either. So
No.
it's, I didn't see it coming, right? But at the same time, it's always surprising that it's something that bad, obviously. Sure. But it's not surprising that something happened. And I mean,
we knew there was a risk.
Yeah, and for, just from the Rockets' perspective, obviously, I didn't get a chance to talk about this from just the human perspective, and now that that's never lost, but people aren't really talking about that anymore. But
yeah, and I'll point out that in terms of just the overall impact, for those who want more perspective on that, you can check out our archives. I had an immediate reaction show the day we learned of it on Monday, September 11th. And then later in the week, once news broke of potential trade possibilities, I did a show reacting to that as well. And why I honestly don't think it's unethical to trade him as long as he doesn't play in the NBA, be it for the Rockets or someone else, and hopefully he doesn't make any money, assuming he did what he's accused of doing, and there seems to be at least some evidence of. But ultimately, that's up to the NBA as far as voiding his contract, not the Rockets. But to me, as long as he doesn't play and hopefully doesn't receive money or at least less money, then ultimately, I think that's all that matters in terms of the ethics of the situation and the mechanism of removing him from the roster, be it a trade or waiving. To me, that doesn't really matter. And we will talk about some of the trade possibilities on today's show. I was trying to stall on that a bit until we had Paulo on again. But yeah, just to, I guess, underscore the point you were making, it's not so much that we're downplaying the sensitivity of it. It's just, to me, that's what the immediate reaction was for. Again, we have 2 episodes in our archives going into those themes. And now today we want to spin it a bit more forward in terms of talking about the basketball impacts, the team building aspects, and anything it may say about the Rockets under the past 3 years of Rafael Stone as GM.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get to, which is timing-wise, it's kind of both good and bad. If it were earlier in the offseason, Rockets could have planned accordingly. If it were later on, it would have been even harder because once teams start playing, it's even harder. I think the most important thing to take away from it, from a Rockets perspective, is, listen, I don't think it's unethical for the Rockets to trade him just because he's going to get, like, his contract doesn't change because the Rockets trade him. The Rockets are just trading him because they need, the Rockets were an under the cap team, or they worked as a space team for this year, right? So their payroll is not among the lowest in the league, but they didn't get a chance to bloat it up to close to the salary, to the luxury tax, which is what they've been at during the rebuild and what usually teams are at to maximize, all the flexibility that they have. And so because of that, the 16 million approximately 16 million that KPJ is making become a lot more relevant because they are a larger percentage of the cap than they would be if the Rockets had their salary at the level that I just mentioned. And so for Rafael Stone, it's also kind of a two-edged sword or a double-edged sword because, well, if the season goes badly, right, the KPJ stuff is not going to be an excuse if it comes to firing him, right? If the season is a failure, he's going to get fired, and it's not going to be an excuse that the KPJ stuff happened at a time that he couldn't really deal with it.
No, absolutely
or
not,
prepare
because
accordingly.
Rafael Stone was the one who brought in Kevin Porter Jr. in the first
Yeah.
place. So if that risk ends up derailing the Rockets in a significant way, yeah, he can't blame that. That's absolutely a fair observation.
Right. But I was even starting at the point where, before the discourse shifted to him being the one that kept KPJ here for so long, even if that weren't the case, this likely isn't enough to give him a year or to give him the year for free, right? If things go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so he can't use the KPJ stuff as an excuse. So he has to make a move, because if the team plays badly and a KPJ trade or a player that comes with the KPJ trade or multiple players make somewhat of a difference, we're talking about a team that's going to be fighting for the play, and it's likely going to be a couple of games difference. I mean, optimistically, they'll be within a couple of games, and one player making $16 million a year over the course of an 82 game season may shift one or two wins to either side. And it may be the difference between the team making the play-in and him likely keeping his job, or the team not making the play-in. So from the Rockets' perspective, they have to do something, because even though this sucks, people's careers are on the line. And so it's a tough balance to strike. I understand why they're doing it. And to me, as long as KPJ is not benefiting from it, like a lot of people seem to mention that, who'd take the PR hit of trading for KPJ? I don't even think the PR hit would be that big at all. I mean, you get to be the team that waived them, right? Any PR hit that would be taken would be the Rockets for accommodating him for so long. It would never be the team that's trading for him, because everybody knows it's widespread. And with the way media works nowadays, the team could easily put out a statement saying, "Hey, we traded for him, but we plan immediately to waive him. There was no consideration to him as a player. It was just a financial move." Right. So I think some teams may still be wary of trading for him, but I don't think it's as big of a deal as a lot of people are making it out to be. It's social media, reactionary stuff. It happens all the time. And at the same time, there's been precedent. Things not as bad as what KPJ did, but
well, there was the Jabari Bird situation, which is a almost perfect apples to apples.
Oh, right, yeah, but it was I think it was it was a lower profile.
Yeah, it was a lower
player,
profile. Just saying the severity was similar,
yeah,
in terms of it being a really awful, violent thing. But yeah, your point is well taken. It did not register on the national scale to the extent that this did.
Yeah, so basically, there's obviously Enes Kanter, who was not in the league. He obviously didn't do anything to the scale, but who was not in the league at the time, got traded anyways. There was Myers Leonard from the Heat, who was suspended, traded by the Heat to the Thunder, and the Thunder then proceeded to waive him. Like this has happened before with players that are basically out of the league for one reason or another that is not basketball related. And they get traded because the teams that had them previously are in a position where they really can't afford to have that salary, chunk go to waste by waiving him. So shifting a little bit of the conversation, I think what we should be looking for, or what the Rockets will be looking for, is for a team that either has a player that has a contract that whose length goes beyond this year, which is what KPJ has guaranteed. He has 1 million next year, but that's pretty minimal. Either team that has a contract like that, that's looking to not have that commitment going forward, or a team that really doesn't care about what they do this year.
Mhm.
And so because of that, they're willing to trade KPJ for KPJ and waive him because they don't mind having that chunk of salary allocated to a guy that's just that he's going to be that cap the moment you waive him, and is doing it for whatever draft compensation is attached to it. And I know further along this episode, I'll get into a little bit of what I think is adequate, what I think is adequate salary compensation, and at which point I would just say, hey, it's not worth it, and just take the hit that KPJ is not here and give the minutes to Amen and Cam Whitmore. Um, which I think are probably the guys that stand the most to gain as far as opportunity goes going forward in the rotation.
Yeah, I'll say as far as the trade parameters, we can lead off with that. Shams Charania of The Athletic, one of the 2 or 3 biggest newsbreakers in the game, has reported that the Rockets are trying to attach a number of second-round picks. I'm okay with that because generally speaking, well, number one, the Rockets do still have a slight surplus of second-round picks, even after the controversial Usman Garuba and Ty Washington trade. We'll talk about that in a little bit because there is a KPJ connection there, at least theoretically, there is one. But even after that, there's still a surplus, and that's part of their motivation for doing so. They felt like they had a huge surplus. And beyond that, it's honestly not that difficult to recoup second round picks, even if you do use a few for a deal like this. And we've seen an increasing amount the last few years of sort of stacking second round picks, 3 or 4 together for one role player to a rotation type who isn't good enough to get a first. And one reason why I'm okay with it, it's honestly not that difficult to replenish, be it, first off, if you scout well and have your pick of the undrafted free agent guys, then you can perhaps get the same value in that capacity. But beyond that, there's teams that are selling second round picks every year. You can get second round picks for taking on assets or sending cash to teams that are in a bad spot with the luxury tax. There's ways you can replenish that. To me, where I draw the line, and it sounds like the Rockets have as well, I would not attach a first round pick. It's not just because of the value, because sure, you could theoretically protect a first round pick and certainly make the argument from a value perspective that just look at Usman Garuba and Ty Washington and Josh Christopher. A lot of picks in the 20s don't work out anyway. So why is it that big of a deal to give up one of those? And especially in the scenario where you're giving up 3 or 4 second round pick. And the answer is the Stepien rule. Because with this window kicking in where Houston's assets are most likely going to Oklahoma City, now they're offset by the unprotected picks going from Brooklyn to the Rockets. But basically, the next 7 years, you have one first round pick in nearly all of those years. You aren't doubling up because, again, in most of the years that you have something coming from Brooklyn, you're likely losing yours to Oklahoma City, or it's a swap year, not a year that you have two. So, because of that, if you give up a future first round pick, then not only does it take that out of bounds for a potential superstar trade down the line. We did a Joel Embiid episode last month about that hypothetical, but it also takes picks in the years surrounding that potentially out of bounds because you can't be without a first round pick in consecutive future drafts. So when you're in a situation like the Rockets and you don't have the ability to double up in a given year on first round draft picks, then you have to be really careful when you give out a future first round pick. And so it sounds like that's where they've drawn the line, and I'm okay with that. It's not so much about value because, yeah, pick in the 20s, if you could theoretically send out a protected future first, it's not super valuable. But at the end of the day, it's not just about that. It's about the Stepien rule and having full flexibility to make big time trade offers for superstars down the line. And so if it comes to a situation where no one is willing to take Kevin Porter Jr. because of the PR, whatever it may be, without a first round pick, then at some point you do just have to walk away and say, you know what, we're just going to eat the contract, we're going to waive him, and maybe the NBA just ends up voiding all or part of it down the line, hope for the best, but just sort of take the cash savings and accept that it's just not worth it to trade. But if you can trade it without attaching a first round pick, for me that's the line, and it sounds like the Rockets view that as the line as well. Then yeah, I would do it because I don't think the second round picks are all that impactful in the grand scheme. I think you can recoup a lot of that value if you're smart with your asset management, if you will. And in this case, look, it can serve multiple purposes. You hit the nail on the head, Paulo. I mean, you need that Kevin Porter Jr. salary slot. They have the two human trade exception guys, Jock Landale and Jeff Green, but that's only about 20 million. You need a bit more salary that's not a big commitment to the other team, but at the same time isn't indispensable to your formula for success, because you don't want to subtract so much from your team that you're making the team less desirable to the superstar who is considering you in the first place, probably because you have a lot of young talent already in place. So that's where that salary slot, even if it's not KPJ, someone in a mid-tier salary, $10 to $15 million a year, if you could add that to the human TPE guys, then that's really useful, because you can get to a pretty high figure already without having to significantly detract from your current team. And again, you want to keep as much of your current team together as you can, because you want to be attractive to that guy and be able to win if and when you make that type of big move. So the salary slot is important. And then just from a basketball standpoint, the 3-point shooting is a big deal. Look, a lot of people have rightfully pointed out Kevin Porter Jr.'s deficiencies as a point guard the last couple of years, but he was one of the best catch and shoot guys in the entire NBA. This is a guy who could shoot in the mid to high 30s on high volume, and he was getting more efficient. Over the last basically 4 months of last season, his true shooting percentage was nearly 60. That's something on the second unit. And again, even before this, I don't think Kevin Porter Jr. was likely to start. I think it was always going to be Fred VanVleet, Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, Jabari Smith Jr., and Alperen Şengün. I guess a small possibility that Tari outplays Jabari, but I think that's less likely after Summer League. So when you look at KPJ's expected role, that shooting off the bench in particular is really important, because we know Amin Thompson isn't a shooter, at least not yet. Jayshawn Tate is not a shooter. Tari Eason was a bit better as a shooter than expected, but there's still some questions as to how sustainable it is and how much you can scale it up in terms of volume. So Kevin Porter Jr. was going to be very useful to that second unit to really provide some floor balance. So beyond the salary slot, which is important in the grand scheme to have trade filler to give you more options down the line, Woj reported this week that in the next, 9 to 12 months, the feeling around the NBA is that multiple elite players could be on the trade market, pointing to Embiid, who we've discussed. Giannis, even according to a few recent reports, isn't fully locked in as far as his future with Milwaukee and 100% wanting to be there. There's all sorts of possibilities that might be coming down the pike that you want to leave yourself open to. And so the contract is part of it. But then the basketball, the short term, in a season where the Rockets, for a lot of reasons, as you laid out, want to take a step forward, then yeah, the 3-point shooting is an important variable as well. So, the names that I think, I mentioned Landry Shamet of the Wizards. To me, that's ideal, because not only is he making about $10 million this season, but he also has a couple of non-guaranteed / team options for the subsequent years. So in some ways, it's like a slightly smaller version of the contract you just had with Kevin Porter Jr. And for his career, Shamet shoots above nearly 39% from 3-point range. So he can really space the floor and provide some of what you're losing in terms of the floor spacing from Kevin Porter Jr. Another name I've seen thrown out there is Alec Burks of the Pistons. He's on an expiring $10 million deal, but who knows, you would have his bird rights in this scenario. And as far as the basketball merits, he's a guy who's a movement shooter. He's shot about 38% from three for his career. So those are guys that have stood out to me as logical targets. Shams reported today that Indiana could be looking to move Buddy Hield, who is in that same salary ballpark. Again, with Kevin at about 15 million, anything between 10 and 20 is potentially doable. You're in the ballpark to where it wouldn't take a ton of extra maneuvering either direction. And, you're not going to get Hield for Kevin Porter Jr. because Kevin's a negative asset, considering he's basically out of the league at this point, and it's a sunk cost. Maybe the NBA ends up voiding some or all of the deal, but it's not a positive asset by any stretch of the imagination. He's done, assuming the allegations are even close to true, which to this point there seems to be a lot of evidence that they are. So, Heel then instead of wouldn't be Kevin Porter Jr., you'd be using it to match, and then you'd have to trade, future pick assets. Maybe Jayshawn Tate could have a role with the Pacers, who could use a little bit more defense in their front court. There's lots of paths you could potentially explore there. I think Heel would obviously be a bit pricier in terms of the asset cost than a Shamet or a Burks. But at the end of the day, it's still the same, sort of shooting mold. So for me, it's just sort of like there's two boxes you want to check. you want to replace the movement shooting for that second unit in terms of basketball. And then ideally, you want to replace the salary slot as well. And, maybe it's a multi-year deal. Maybe it's like Shamit where you have some team options attached, but even if it's a expiring deal, then that's fine because you would have the bird rights on that player and you can at least have some control over what you do with that salary slot, or maybe you could trade him again at the deadline in exchange for a player with a contract for the next year that, the team at that point is trying to pivot and go into tank mode, create more salary cap space for the off season. The point is you'd have future options. So to me, it's a combination of the movement shooting and the trade filler salary. That's what they're looking for. I would not give up a first round pick to make that happen because I think that's just too valuable in terms of what you could do down the line and superstar trade offers and the Stepien rule. If you trade a first round pick, it puts you in a really tough spot since the Rockets don't have any double up years moving forward, at least not guaranteed. I know there's some light protections on the picks to Oklahoma City, but hopefully those don't convey because the Rockets don't want to be among the 4 worst teams in the NBA again. Well, I guess you don't want to say hopefully because maybe they missed the playoffs barely, they lose in the play-in tournament, and then they defy the odds and get a top 4 pick through the lottery. Certainly won't turn that down. But the idea is that you're not trying to be bad. So those picks probably are going to head to Oklahoma City, and you don't want to bank on those picks conveying. And even if that theoretically happens, that doesn't save you from the Stepien rule. So the bottom line is Shamit, Burks, those jump out to me as potential possibilities that make sense. Hield is something that to a point I would explore, although I'd be hesitant, again, to give up first round assets for the same reason. You have to balance that against what you can do for superstars down the line. Those are 3 names that have resonated with me. Paulo, any thoughts on those or anyone else you want to potentially add to the mix?
Yeah, I think the report came out today. It certainly makes a lot of sense to play that 6-man role, to play next to Amen Thompson. It just makes too much sense. The only thing is the type of team, like I don't think the Pacers are trying to be bad, right? And so I think the more most of the value that the Rockets will be giving up will be through second round picks. And I think the Pacers would value, I don't know, I think for the Pacers it would make sense to make a trade with Dallas, for example, for Tim Hardaway Jr., who's a slightly worse player. He's a year older, but he can do a lot of the same stuff, and he is on a cheaper contract for 1 more year. Because it seems that the Pacers, at least according to the report, it seems like that the Pacers were trying to extend the contract with Buddy Hield, and they just couldn't reach an agreement, and Tim Hardaway Jr. gives them 1 extra year to make that decision. And the Pacers are usually content with being somewhat mediocre, and Tim Hardaway Jr. is kind of like that mode of player. That being said, I'd also like to mention that in terms of what I'm willing to give up in trade, I think it makes sense. Just like you said, up until the moment you have to give up a first round pick, it makes sense. If you need to give up a first round pick, very few players in the league I'll be okay doing it for. And as far as the protections, you talked about the Stepien rule, and I just wanted to add on top of what you already said that I think the picks the Rockets have right now, they're all too valuable to trade in a scenario like this. The Brooklyn picks have high upside. The Rockets' own picks, I mean, the Rockets haven't been good yet for us to start worrying about trading our own picks again, unless it's for a superstar. And the alternative to that is to trade a pick and then protect it. Even if it's a Brooklyn pick, you can protect it and have the top, I don't know, lottery protected. And if it lands in the lottery, it comes back to the Rockets, even though it's Brooklyn's pick. The problem with that is that protecting a pick makes it so the impact via the Stepien rule lingers much longer. If it's a pick that's protected for the first year and then becomes unprotected, that's 3 years that are now entangled in the Stepien rule. So the year of the picks protected in, potentially the year after, because you can't make a trade and risk not having something to give up to the team that didn't get a protected pick in the first place, and the year after, because if the pick does not convey and becomes second, and it conveys in the second year and protected, then in the third year you need to have a pick to make up for the Stepien rule. So once you get into protections, it becomes harder to make a deal, and you'd need protections in order for a first round pick to be guaranteed to be a late first round pick, as you said. So getting that out of the way, I think, as I said before, we need to target teams that are either don't have aspirations this year or are looking for cap relief. And this early on,
yeah, Washington and Detroit, certainly Washington, maybe Detroit fit. So that's another perk for Shamet and Burks.
For sure. And I think, there's basically, at this point, there's basically no teams looking for salary cap relief because the season hasn't started yet. No teams have been disappointed. No teams are going, most teams had a plan going into the offseason. They won't be over the salary level they want to be at this point. They'll likely adjust over the course of the season like they always do. I think there's potential with the Trailblazers if a Lillard trade does materialize and they shift into a rebuild. Although there's not many shooter types, which I agree would be what the Rockets are targeting, or at least guard types on that team, unless they want to. I don't think they could because he just signed. But if they wanted to trade for someone like Jeremy Grant, who just got overpaid by a massive amount, and if they trade Lillard, that contract makes even less sense. If the Rockets want to take a shot at that, which hopefully they don't, that could make sense because that's a team that is not trying to rebuild right now, but could be forced into it if things pan out a certain way. But I think the main team to look at is the Wizards, and you already mentioned Shemet, who is obviously my first target as well. I would be interested in, this is going to go back to my wish of having a rim protecting center. I'll be interested in Gafford, even though he plays a different position, just because I think he's good and he's on a team friendly deal. And, he offers something that the Rockets don't currently have. I'm not sure if Chuck Landale is going to be the one to provide it to them, which is just a typical pick and roll rebounding, rim protecting big. There's obviously still Tyus Jones there. And another thing that's worth pointing out, which could just get resolved by waiving players, but I think it's unlikely that it will, is the Wizards, I think, are currently at 17 players. They just signed, I forget his name, the vet that was with the Knicks that Thibs loves, Dutch Gibson. They're at 17 guys, and I'm looking at the list, and most of them are either young players or guys that have a place in this league that they will likely have to move. So I think they'll be trading. I don't think they'll be waiving. I don't think there's any guy here. If there was a guy to be waived, I would say it's Dutch Gibson, but they just signed him, so it's unlikely that he is him.
Dutch Gibson is definitely not him, by the way.
Yeah. Fair enough. So other than that, just a bunch of rookie contracts, a bunch of second round picks that got signed to the Hinkie special, and then the two big mammoth contracts that they have in Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma. So I think Tyus Jones, Daniel Gafford, even DeLon Wright or Danilo Gallinari could be options if we wanted to do a 2-for-1, which we do have the roster spot to do so, I believe. Those are what I'm looking at for the Wizards because they have no aspirations with this roster. Let's be honest, they switched GMs. They're going into a rebuild. Everybody knows this. They blew it up. They traded Bradley Beal. They traded Porzingis. So, and then other than that, I think a couple of other names that I think are worth looking at is Doug McDermott with the Spurs, Reggie Bullock, who went there from Dallas, and I don't quite remember the trade, but he was just basically filler. I don't think they traded for him. And Devontae Graham, who I think came from the Pelicans in a similar situation. All three of them are good shooters at different positions. Could fit somewhat of a role. The fact that Amen Thompson can play multiple positions defensively makes it so the Rockets are more versatile in the position they target for their shooting. I'm not sure if the Spurs are trying to be good this year. I think it will heavily rely on on how good is Wemby, and they could shift very quickly. And then the last guy I would mention, and people are not gonna like this example, but it could make sense. Duncan Robinson is no longer a 5-year or a 6-year contract. Right. He's a 3-year contract now. It's 18, 19, 20. It's still not pretty. He's still not worth that kind of money, but that kind of money is less now than it was back when this contract was first signed. And we know that Miami is trying to trade for Damian Lillard. And if Duncan Robinson is a part of that deal, I think it's fairly likely that the Blazers don't want anything to do with that contract. And it could make sense as Duncan Robinson might be a guy that you actually get a second round pick with instead of giving one up with KPJ, right? Because in this scenario, I think the fact that he still has this much of his contract left is is a pretty good, incentive to taking on KPJ and just waiving him. If you are a team like the Blazers, who would be then moving into a rebuild, right? They wouldn't care. They would just get the flexibility instantly. So yeah, the last thing I would mention is when giving up picks, second round picks, which is what I'm assuming we'll be giving up, I would really like it if they try to give up second round picks this year, because we have 3 of
Yep.
them.
Agree.
We're not gonna make 3 second round picks, and it's basically, unless you're starting off a rebuild, it's never worth it to make 3 second round picks, because you'll likely get similar value just by giving contracts to undrafted free agents. And
And your roster is fairly deep with young players already.
yeah, so if even without Christopher, Taitai, and Garuba, there's a reason those guys hit waivers and the Rockets didn't go back after them. I mean, they wanted to fill out the roster with vets like Boban, who just got re-signed. I don't know if you mentioned this in any of the past 2 pods. I don't think he did, because it was very recent. So it's unlikely that they'll make those 3 picks. And once draft day comes, unless someone's falling and unless you get really lucky and someone calls you, you likely have to just take a guy. And there's multiple
Yeah.
examples of teams just taking a guy and then not even having the roster spot for them and having to sign them to 2-way contracts and situations like that. So I'd be looking out if Rockets went for a trade right now. Yes, it would be because what happened to KPJ happened, but the fact that they have 3 second round picks this year could also be an incentive for them to make a move, versus just standing pat and waiving
Yeah.
KPJ.
One point I want to throw in quickly before we transition to the rest of the current team and this Kevin Porter Jr. inevitable departure news. Maybe it happens this week. Maybe it drags out until closer to the opening of training camp in October, because it's a deadline-driven league, and for a lot of these roster decisions elsewhere, it may take until closer to training camp to prompt them to actually make a decision and act, because that's the real deadline. You don't want to take a player to media day, to training camp, who you're not ultimately going to have, or at least are likely to have on your roster moving forward. It's just a waste of resources. It's awkward. So that's a deadline. Maybe something happens sooner rather than later. I'm sure the Rockets would love for it to happen immediately. It's just a matter of whether you can incentivize the other team to do so. And when we're talking about a situation like Kevin Porter Jr., which is obviously so uncomfortable, it may take a little bit of deadline pressure to move someone over the finish line. The one point I want to throw in, and this ties in with your examples of Doug McDermott and Duncan Robinson, as far as the PR angle, my position, I said it earlier on this show, I said it on our last show. I really don't think it's a huge PR hit for the team trading for Kevin Porter Jr. as long as they waive him immediately. If they're not trying to play him, if they immediately waive him as a condition of the trade and he doesn't get anything as far as playing time, exposure from them, as far as the guaranteed money, I mean, hopefully he doesn't get any of it. If this proves to be true, the NBA can void the deal altogether. But regardless, that's coming to him no matter what. That's under the terms of his contract that he already has. That's not the other team that's choosing to give him that money. That's already done, a decision the Rockets made, which we'll get into shortly. I will say that that's my guess as to the way this market plays out. And I think that's the way it should play out. Look, this is a sensitive issue, and some teams may take a different stance. Some teams may say, you know what, if there's even a 5% chance of an avalanche of bad PR from us doing this, it's not worth it, especially if the upside is only a few second round picks. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there will be a market, but you never know. It's absolutely a possibility. And that may drive a few teams out of the market. I hope it doesn't. Gun to my head, I don't think it does, but you can't rule it out. In that scenario, teams like the Spurs and the Heat, who have an organization that has a lot of trust equity amongst NBA media and fans, in my opinion, would be more confident and likely to still do the deal if they see basketball slash asset value to them for doing so. And I know the Spurs did have the Josh Primo situation, but by and large, it's still the head coach, GM, owner that won all those titles. They're well respected organizationally. Certainly the Heat with Pat Riley, they're one of the best run organizations in the game. I think those are the teams that if the Rockets are in a tight spot, might still do it because ultimately I think people are going to give those organizations the benefit of the doubt when it comes to questionable PR in the way that some organizations, including the Rockets, because, Rafael Stone has yet to build a winner and he's only been on the job since late 2020. Tillman Fertitta took over at the end of, he did have a couple of contending teams, but didn't win a ring and then immediately went into a rebuild. Wasn't really his fault, but at the end of the day, it's not like Tillman Fertitta is a proven owner in terms of building a consistent winner. So that's why the Rockets don't get the benefit of the doubt with a lot of these sort of culture narratives, because the guys at the top of the food chain for the Rockets organizationally haven't proven it. And before this year, Stephen Silas was a first-time head coach. There's a bit more credibility now with Ime Udoka, although he has a bit of baggage as well. So organizations like the Rockets, and there's a few others, do get judged a bit more harshly because there's not that proven figure of authority that people point to, like Greg Popovich or Pat Riley, and say, that guy won't let it get too bad. That guy deserves the benefit of the doubt. And so, in a scenario where maybe some other young teams that don't have an established culture, like the Wizards or Pistons, are perhaps a bit more reluctant to get into the KPJ talks, then it's good to have backup plans from more established teams, because I do think that could help a little bit on the PR front. I think those teams might be more likely to take the risk because they know the fallout would not be as bad. They typically get the benefit of the doubt. Now, as far as the basketball impact, we talked about what the Rockets need from a trade in terms of replacing the shooting of Kevin Porter Jr. Because even if he's not the point guard anymore, even if those skills aren't that important, look, you do need shooting. And he was one of the best catch and shoot guys in the NBA at volume the last couple of years. So it is going to be lost. The Rockets do want to win more games. But let's not minimize it. There were risk factors going in beyond some off-court incident like what ultimately transpired. There's also the question of, after being the starting point guard for 2+ years, was Kevin Porter Jr. going to go quietly into the night and accept a 6-man role? Would he accept losing his double locker? We had an episode on that a few weeks ago. There were these risk factors for sure. But in this scenario, even if it was far from certain, where Kevin Porter Jr. accepted the lesser role and bought in, and who knows, perhaps having a bit less minutes and less playmaking responsibility could have let him use his 6'6" frame a bit more actively on the defensive end, then yes, there's a world where he could really contribute to a solid basketball team with the Rockets. So from that point, it does lower your ceiling, at least as of now. And that's not an insignificant variable to consider in a year where the Rockets want to win games. Again, even if the fit might be a bit cleaner in some areas and you don't have that Kevin Porter Jr. cloud hanging over the organization, at the same time, we don't want to dismiss the basketball elements altogether, because we've seen the last couple of years the rot of losing, as we've referred to numerous times, is real. And if at some point, even if you have the right coach, even if you believe in your talent, if they're not winning enough games and they're out of contention before the calendar even turns 2024, then yeah, it's hard not to see that eventually taking a toll as far as habits on the court, and especially when we're talking about practices and buying in and being in the right headspace. Yeah, that's been a factor the last couple of years. And so the fact that losing KPJ does lower the ceiling of the team, it's not insignificant. Now, it's not an apples to apples with the last 2 years, and the hope is you have a much better head coach in Ime Udoka. You also signed veterans that know how to play, Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks. So hopefully your floor is a lot higher to begin with. And so even without KPJ, you don't sink to the depths of the last couple of years. And so you're still at least relevant no matter what. But I at least want to acknowledge the basketball side of this because it's not insignificant. With that said, while the Rockets do need to ideally replace his shooting and some of what they're losing, I do see some potential positives from the standpoint of long-term development. Again, there is a short-term hit. I do think it diminishes the ceiling of this year's team, barring a major transaction. But you can also rightfully point out that, look, this is not a year where you're trying to win a championship anyway. It's still about the second phase of the rebuild and transitioning out of being a cellar dweller to being more competitive, hopefully making somewhat of a push for the play-in, the way we saw teams like Utah and Oklahoma City do for portions of last season. Oklahoma City actually did get into the play-in mix. Of course, that's not a perfect parallel because they have SGA, but the idea is to be a little bit ahead of schedule, make some progress, and ultimately that's what the Rockets want to do. But even in this ideal scenario where they exceed all expectations, maybe Jalen Green and or Alperen Şengün take the leap, it's not a year where you're going to be anywhere close to competing for a championship. So you can point out that even if KPJ lowers your basketball ceiling this year, how important is that really, as long as you avoid the rot of losing, because you weren't going to win a title anyway? That's fair. And through that lens, you can absolutely point out that beyond just having less risk factor in terms of will there be locker room chaos if KPJ doesn't accept the role, will there be some off-court incident that turns into a distraction for the team? Beyond that, I also think there's positives just from the standpoint of simplifying roles for players within the existing rotation, and especially two guys in your backcourt that you're trying to develop long term, Jalen Green and Amin Thompson. With Jalen Green, look, if Kevin Porter Jr., a player of a similar archetype, a similar mold, similar body type for that matter, was on this roster, there were going to be games where Jalen might not finish, because I think you look at, the closing lineup, and those reps are especially important given the leverage of those situations for development. I think Fred and Dylan were always going to be out there for defense. There's a reason you paid all that money. And while there might be a few matchups where you go small and slide Dylan to the 4, I think against most teams, your front court, you're going to have two front court players, and it'll be a combination of Jabari Smith, Tari Eason, and Alperen Şengün. And so there's one spot, and I think Jalen, he was going to start, and if he has it going, he'd be the closer. But there were going to be some games where Jalen might be looking over his shoulder. If he's having an off night and Kevin has it going, then in a year where the Rockets want to win, there might have been some temptation, even though developing Jalen is better for the long term. You play Kevin down the stretch because you feel like you need to win that game. So it's sort of the short term versus the long term. Now the Rockets don't really have a choice. You have to ride Jalen. You have to prioritize him. And so on some level, I think it'll make Jalen more confident. He's not having to look over his shoulder. He's not having to worry. He's the guy. He can accept the responsibility, and the Rockets will sink or swim based on his performance. And then as far as the second unit, while I do think you need to replace the shooting, and even if they can't trade KPJ for a shooter, there's also other options. The Rockets will have a pretty favorable waiver wire position coming out of preseason cuts. So the way they added Garrison Matthews a couple of years ago, and he was helpful in that first year, maybe you can add a shooter that way as well, depending on who gets released at the end of the preseason. Stay tuned for that. Again, the Rockets, the initial waiver position will be based on last season's records, so the Rockets will be very high in the order. That's an option. And again, as far as Amin, you do need a shooter out there to, I guess, give more floor balance, especially if he's going to be playing with Jae'Sean Tate as well. But also, look, Kevin Porter Jr. has functioned as a point guard the last 2 years. I did worry a little bit about just how much Amin is going to get to operate and truly get the keys to that second unit if he's sharing the court with the guy who was the point guard the last 2 years and has repeatedly referred to himself as such. I did have some nagging fear in the back of my mind that Amin might be a bit more off ball than he should be, at least in year one, based on this transition period for KPJ. Well, now your second unit, you can give Amin Thompson the keys. Even if he's only playing 15 to 20 minutes per game at first, you can say in those 15 or 20 minutes, we're giving you the keys to this offense. You can take your lumps, but you can learn, you can get the reps. And so I think, again, it's not meant to minimize the basketball impacts. It does lower your ceiling, and that's not insignificant this year. You do need to avoid the rot of losing. But as long as you can, and I think it's reasonable to say that you can, between Fred, Dylan, and Ime Udoka, as long as you can maintain at least a competent floor, then I think in a season that's ultimately more about the long term anyway and the steady growth of your core six, it could potentially be beneficial to you in the long term because it simplifies roles for Jalen and Amin. And to me, that's sort of I hesitate to use the term silver lining because obviously this is an awful situation that you never want to get into, but strictly from a basketball standpoint, that might be some consolation you can take out of this. That's my view, at least.
Yeah, I think my two main takeaways, one of them just coincides with what you said. I think this is, or depending on what they move KPJ for, if they do, this is just a lot more pressure and a lot more responsibility for Amin Thompson. But I mean, no, Summer League means nothing, but he's got the defense down. He doesn't have the shooting down, but I think he'll be fine with more responsibility. I'm kind of happy that he gets it. obviously having KPJ, the player there playing, would probably be better because he's more seasoned and he is overall better basketball player right now for wins from a wins perspective. That was more important. I do like that Aman and I'll get into the second player. I do like Aman getting more responsibility and getting more minutes because well, it's important and I'm sure it's important for job security for Rafael Stone and everybody in the building to make the play in this year. I would rather I'm not gonna say knowing that the play-in is not a guarantee. I would rather Aman Thompson get the reps he needs versus him not getting and you still risking not making the play-in. It's a tough balance to strike there, right? Because you're not guaranteed either thing with either player. But I also think that if it's not going right, there's always more things you can do between stagger Sengun more with the second unit so you can run the offense a little bit more. Between Jalen Green playing with the second unit as well and running the offense a little bit if a man is struggling, right? There's other avenues and other ball handlers that you can go to. Jabari Smith showed flashes of not ball handling, but of being an offensive option in summer league. How much of that translates to the NBA? Maybe Jabari gets some more reps and some more plays set up for him, and maybe he's the one that steps up and carries that second unit. But if a trade doesn't happen, but I think it's exciting because this is about the young players, and KPJ was a pretty big. I'm not gonna call it a black hole, but something close to it as far as reps go. It has been the last 3 years. Either I'm sure he tried to do his best to play point guard, but he wasn't the point guard, and the Rockets have missed that very much. And we talked the entire offseason about the need for a point guard. Well, even in the second unit, he would be a little bit of a black hole, and we were hoping that he'd turn to a more off-ball role. But let's be honest, the most likely scenario was that at least between him and Aman Thompson, that he'd just take most of the reps. But besides Aman, who I'm excited to watch play more, and hopefully this means that we'll get more Aman Galen minutes because that's really exciting as a backcourt in transition and just the athleticism. Um, the other guy that I wish benefited from it, I'm not sure if you will, is Cam Whitmore. It will obviously depend on how he looks. I think it will most of all depend on how his shot looks, because the only way I think he gets minutes from this is if his shot is big enough of a difference compared to Jayshawn Tate, that they'd rather have him out there with less experience and with making rookie mistakes than they would say just because he would have to be respected as a shooter and the implication that would have for spacing, especially on a team that's going to have a Man Thompson as a non-shooter, Dylan Brooks as a poor shooter. And then basically no floor spacing bigs unless Sengun develops a 3-point shot, which I mean there are some clips out there, but who knows? It's the offseason. Ben Simmons taught us that a long time ago. But yeah, so if Cam Whitmore is good enough of a shooter that he warrants playing time versus Jayshawn because Jayshawn can't shoot, and you can tell me he spent the summer in the gym and he has reworked
Right.
his 3-point shot. I'm not falling for that again. To me, he's a non-shooter until proven otherwise on an NBA court. I think this could have that implication for Cam versus when KPJ was there. I think it was a foregone conclusion that Cam was not going to get minutes and was going to go to the G League basically from the get-go. So hopefully this means Cam gets shot, but I think more likely than not, this means Jayshawn Tate plays, or perhaps maybe Jeff Green plays, right? You could you
Mhm.
could theoretically you could play Jeff Green at the 4 and shift Harrison to the 3, at least on that bench unit, and then you could work it out that way. But yeah, that's basically as far as on the court implications. I think that's basically covers it for me.
I like that neither of us focused on Alperen Şengün a lot because I think that narrative is being overdone. Now, for starters, there was never going to be, in all likelihood, a significant tie between KPJ and Şengün this year. Of course, there would have been a little bit of overlap, but the odds-on scenario was KPJ going to the bench and Şengün starting. So in terms of those two coexisting and just prioritizing one inherently make you prioritize the other a bit less, and that debate that's been out there for some time. Some of that was going to resolve itself anyway this year because you were starting Fred VanVleet at point guard and probably bringing KPJ off the bench. So that's part of it. But even in hindsight, I think there's some nuance in terms of the Kevin Porter Jr. discourse right now that's getting lost. And specifically, there's a lot of frustration amongst certain segments of the Rockets online community, be it social media, blogs, at the usage of Alperen Şengün. And it wasn't just last year. I mean, he had great numbers on a per 36 basis in year one. He was playing behind Christian Wood and even Daniel Tice for long stretches of his rookie season. And last year, it wasn't just the fact that now it was only a game and a half before Bruno Fernando got hurt. It wasn't just that he started the season on the bench. Even when he started, he didn't get the touches, the shot attempts that a lot of people wanted. And there were games in which Stephen Silas didn't let him close because they were so fixated on his defense. Now, maybe some of that is a Stephen Silas thing. Who knows? We'll see this year how Ime Udoka chooses to handle it. But there were a lot of people, I think, that made out this Kevin Porter Jr. situation to be the boogeyman because it's just cleaner. Basically, the idea being if you take Kevin Porter Jr. out of the mix and this narrative that, well, Şengün is a casualty because they want more of a rim running big to pair with KPJ as the point guard, then you just fix the KPJ problem. A lot of people didn't like him to begin with because obviously he was a lightning rod. We know the off-court considerations, and ultimately it did blow up. Kudos to the people that called it. They were right. But in terms of the relationship to Şengün, I think it's a little more complicated than the conventional narrative would lead you to believe. And that's not meant to blindly defend Rafael Stone. I think it's more what I want to point out is that some of their skepticism with regards to Şengün, it's not just about how he fits relative or with KPJ. It's about Şengün's long-term value as a basketball player, as a prospect, period. Keep in mind that this offseason, the Rockets tried everything they could to get Brook Lopez as their starting center. That was with Fred VanVleet as the starting point guard, not Kevin Porter Jr. I've heard the last couple of months, plenty of people in the building at Toyota Center would not be surprised if Jock Landale pushes Alperen Şengün for minutes. Now, that's not me saying I think Landale would start, but that in training camp and early in the season, there might be more of a competition than folks think because Landale is so committed to the defensive end of the court and he plays with so much intensity and focus and drive on that end. And that's something they still want to see more of from Şengün. It's why they targeted Lopez. It's why they pivoted to Landale after that. And you can argue that they're wrong. You can argue that Şengün has been unfairly singled out for his issues on the defensive end when some of them are systemic and some of them were team-wide. That's absolutely reasonable. But at the end of the day, it's not just about the Rockets didn't like Şengün because it was an awkward fit with KPJ. Some of it was that organizationally, the Rockets just weren't as high on Şengün and as a lot of people within the fan community. And I'm not saying they're right. They could be wrong. I'm a Şengün fan. It's entirely possible he comes out and has an amazing year, takes the leap, and then, the Twitter crowd looks right. And people within the Rockets, be it Stephen Silas, Rafael Stone, whoever you want to call out from the last couple of years, end up looking silly for not fully buying in. I just think this whole narrative of, Şengün's development was stunted because of KPJ, it's a little misleading. And beyond just the theoretical exercise, and we talk about what they tried to do this offseason with Brook Lopez, you can also point to the fact that KPJ has missed about 25 games in each of the last two seasons, including 2 straight months almost in January and February of this year. And the offense did not dramatically change. You didn't see a huge pickup in efficiency or Şengün's numbers. It wasn't like KPJ was out and then all of a sudden it became the all-out Shin Hub and he looked like baby Jokic. Now, I'm not saying he didn't. You can argue that he should have gotten more touches. That he should have been used more. You can certainly argue that. But it wasn't as if the offense just dramatically changed as soon as KPJ wasn't a consideration and they had more of a traditional look at point guard, be it Daishen Nix or Ty Washington or whatever they were thrown out there in Kevin's absence. It wasn't like they just started running everything through Şengün and everything just dramatically changed as far as how the offense looked, how the team functioned. We did have a significant sample in each of the last 2 years of Şengün without Kevin, and it was not dramatically different, in my opinion. And again, that's not to blindly defend the Rockets. No, it's entirely possible that the Rockets are too low on Şengün. What I'm saying is that there's a little bit, because it's just easier, especially now that KPJ is clearly done, to paint this KPJ situation as the boogeyman and say this was the reason, and now that he's gone, it's full steam ahead for Alper and Şengün, and now everything is different. Not necessarily. I hope he takes the leap. I hope he proves, I don't want to say proves the Rockets wrong. It's not like I don't believe in him. I just think that they have a little more sort of caution to it than some of his biggest supporters on social media. But to me, I just don't see a huge difference in terms of the outlook for Şengün based on this. And some of that is because Kevin Porter Jr. wasn't the point guard in the first place for this coming season, but some of it's because I think the last couple of years, that narrative, while not totally invalid, it's a little overplayed. I do think there's some elements of sort of a boogeyman to that, if you will. Paulo, is there anything you wanted to add on that front before we move on to some of the more cultural elements?
Yeah, I think I think direct correlation to Şengün goes as far, to me, it goes as far as, hey, the offense, right? If KPJ is to be a point guard ever, it is probably with a pick and roll big, or that was the thought at the time. I think like it went as far as Bruno Fernando starting for however many games it was, 10,
Well,
15.
game and a half. No, it was game and a half. He got hurt in the second game of the year.
Right, but didn't he pick it back up for like a week afterwards? I don't remember. It doesn't really matter.
They might have. I mean, it was a small sample, but
yeah, it was a short time. That's the point. I think that was as far as it went. I think the part of not running through Şengün the way a lot of people wanted to, and I wanted to at points as well, was basically that he has a lot of
Şengün actually only came off the bench for 3 games. He started 72 of his 75 games last year. So yeah, very limited.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it goes as far as, the reason he slipped to 16, that archetype of player has trouble sticking in the NBA unless it gets to a superstar level. Right. And because of, and when you run everything through him, well, you're projecting a superstar level out of a guy that was picked 16th for a reason. And so I think that's why the Rockets didn't fully buy into him the way a lot of people wanted to, because, I mean, even if you look at what this organization is, and it's not Daryl Morey anymore, but a lot of people are still there. This is a team that valued defense and three-point shooting, two of the things that Alper Şengün doesn't have. They value switchability. We've seen this over and over again. Like, they value basically the exact opposite basketball principles of what Şengün has. And you could argue that they valued that except for star players, because James Harden was here for a long time and Russell Westbrook, same thing. Yes, you could say that. Once again, it goes back to how much are you willing to bet that he become a superstar player. And I would have argued, and I did argue at points during the past season, that if it's not working, you might as well run through Şengün and see what you have.
Yeah, what do you have to lose?
I advocated for playing Şengün and Christian Wood. I advocated, and when they did, I'm not going to get back into that rant. Let's just let it go, Paulo. But yeah, there's reasons to be skeptical about Şengün. I don't think it was because KPJ was there. It was because KPJ was there to some extent in those very few initial games of the season, but it was also because that's the way they wanted to run the offense. And Stephen Silas, I mean, wasn't great at that. He wasn't great basically anything. But if if you look at the Dallas Mavericks, they played Dwight Powell at center, who is a pick and roll big. And we've made the point time and time again that he tried to fit squared pieces into round holes all the time. And KPJ was supposed to be his Luka, and KPJ wasn't good enough. But Luka played with Dwight Powell, and he was, a James Harden type as heliocentric ball player. And so I don't know how hard this is to understand, but at the same time. And I don't know if you want to move this onto this already, but although it wasn't directly tied to Şengün, I think overall you can still say that giving KPJ so much of a feature in the offense hurts Jalen, hurts Şengün, and hurts Jabari. If nothing else, for the fact that those guys could have gotten more on-ball reps, or if KPJ didn't exist, another point guard would be there, and likely that point guard would have had a little bit more experience in setting guys up, which would have helped Jalen on. Yeah.
Although one more thing I want to push back on, I do not think that going back to John Wall would have been the answer, given how he performed in a rebuild in the second half of that previous season. That's another thing I've seen. You push John Wall out for this guy. I don't think John Wall's the answer. Now, theoretically, you could have gotten more of a traditional point guard, but I don't think the Rockets, moving on from John Wall for Kevin Porter Jr., I think that angle is overplayed too. I do think you can argue now. I would push back a little bit about Jabari because it's not like he's really a shot creator and he just wasn't ready at all for the first half of his rookie season. I don't know how much overlap there is there, and Jalen ultimately has gotten plenty of usage and shot attempts. But to your point, generally speaking, yes, like reps that went to KPJ could have gone to other places. You're right on that. It is fair to say that some of the Rockets' investment in KPJ was misguided and could have been used on players who ultimately didn't flame out of the entire NBA. That is a fair criticism. All I'm trying to do is provide some nuance because I do think some of it, you hear certain names like Şengün and John Wall thrown into it, and it just sort of makes it easier to push that agenda. But I think some of it's a little bit overdone. You can make the case within reason, and I think that's what you're trying to do.
Exactly. I think you can't say with 100% certainty, and I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying in an hypothetical, you can't say that it didn't hurt. I think
No,
at the end of the day,
it did hurt. Yeah.
No, yeah, I know that you're saying it did hurt, just not to the extent that people are making it out to be. And I myself, I'm not saying that they should have kept John Wall for KPJ. No, I celebrated like if we had won the lottery the moment the report came out that the Rockets were going to sit John Wall. Because John Wall was not playing mentor type basketball the year before, and KPJ was already there. He was, I don't know what he was trying to do. I don't know if he was trying to get his next bag or if he thought he was still an all-star or whatever it was.
His podcast interview made it very clear that he did not want to play that role.
Yeah, so the John Wall stuff to me is bogus. But I will say, I think Jalen, if not really because of the on-ball stuff, because I think he played on-ball too much last season. But I think if you replace KPJ with I don't know, you could get a guy for the MLE at the start of the season if you wanted to. Call it Dennis Schroeder, who was here, or call it DJ Augustine, whoever it is, just a step the table type of point guard. Yeah.
You could get Jalen more off-ball shooting opportunities.
Yeah, and I think just if we had
that
more
would
of a
inflate
neutral,
his efficiency.
Yeah, I think if you have more of a neutral point guard instead of KPJ, you would have slightly benefited basically everybody on the team because it's one less inexperienced guy not knowing what he's doing, right? And that always helps from a functionality standpoint. Although they're still coached by Steven Silas, which cannot be diminished, which would still lead to disaster. Even DJ Augustine was a disaster, and Dennis Schroeder was one as well. But he was just less of a disaster than what we were used to. So people kind of cherish his time here for some reason. That being said, just talking about the KPJ experiment as a whole and how that reflects in the organization. Dave Hardesty of Clutch Fans had a great article on it today. And I was expecting it to be more negative and less objective than it was, but it was really well written. And there is a little bit of opinion on there. I mean, fairly so. But he laid out a lot of the reports that came out about KPJ throughout time. And I read it and I came out of it thinking, hey, that's fair enough, right? Me personally, I believed in KPJ, the talent. I thought he had one of the highest ceilings on this team.
Yeah.
And I thought he was worth giving a shot to, especially during a rebuild.
Or rebuilding, yes, the context.
Exactly. I think I wanted to give him a shot. I wanted him still on the team. I was happy with his extension. Throughout the entirety of his time here, I supported him not as at a certain point it stopped being as a point guard because I thought he would be best suited for an off-ball role. But for the most part, I thought it was warranted that he was here. And it was a bet that Rafael Stone made, just like drafting someone is a bet. Allocating the resources to someone is a bet. And if there's something that we know now is that bet ended up not paying off. Just like when you draft a guy and he's a bust, it ends up not paying off, and you do get on your record or on your resume that you took this bet and it didn't work out, and the team paid how much you want to quantify for it in reps and culture and whatever it is. And so I think the Rockets, because Rafael Stone took this bet, are ultimately, knowing the result, worse off than they would be if he hadn't taken it. But who knows, if he hadn't taken this bet, wouldn't he have taken another one that could potentially be worse? We don't know. But compared to a neutral outcome,
Right.
the bet didn't pay off, and so because of it, the Rockets are like, and because of the timing that it didn't pay off at, leaving him very little room to maneuver because teams are mostly set at this point, will hurt the Rockets from a competitive standpoint across the next season. But then again, I don't think it's fair to call for him to be fired right now based on the details that I know so far. But I'm not going to go off on tenuous reports from insiders inside forums that have, a history of posting stuff, but how much of it is truly believable and how much of it is verified, right? I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to go into the public perception of what it is right now, based on what most reporters have reported so far, and the guys that do it for a living, right? And so, as far as that goes, I think it's a bit of a stretch to ask for Rafael Stone to lose his job, because, in my opinion, if you're going to have a results-based analysis of the KPJ situation, you can do that, and that's totally fair. This is sports, that's how it works. And the KPJ bet was a failure, right? And
Yeah.
if your results-based analysis is that's fair. At the same time, if you're going to perform results-based analysis on that, then you have to wait for the results of Rafael Stone's tenure, or the cycle that Rafael Stone put in place, before you judge if you want to fire him or not, unless he does something catastrophic, which would be trading Jalen Green for, a guy that doesn't turn out to be anything, or drafting a guy that's a complete bust in a year or two.
Yeah.
That might warrant firing the GM
At
mid-cycle.
le-
But if not, you have to maintain your results-based analysis, let the team go through the cycle, not, or the first, or the phase of the cycle where results start to matter, before you make that decision, which, with the Rockets, means waiting to see how the next year goes. Because this is, as we've said time and time again, put up or shut up time. This is when what he's been building, what Rafael Stone's been building for the last 3 years, is supposed to provide results, tangible results, not development, which is something that
yeah.
anybody can put their finger on whatever they believe development to be. But now you have a direct, you know, unmistakable barometer for success, which is wins and losses. Do they make the play-in? Do they not? How do they look? Why do they make the play-in, or why do they
And
not make the play-in?
And specifically with Jalen Green and Alfred and Şengün, this is year 3. This is a year where there typically is a breakthrough from guys who are ultimately going to take that leap. They were the first 2 true blue chip prospects. KPJ, we can agree, even internally, the Rockets always viewed him as a lottery ticket. They knew the baggage, they knew the risk. That was a flyer on a guy that even his detractors will certainly admit has a lot of talent. Jalen Green and Alfred Şengün were the first true blue chips that they pulled out internally through their own resources, with a mid first round pick with Şengün, who honestly the Rockets said they were trying to trade for him as soon as he was on the board at 6, and 16 was just the first slot that they could actually get. And fortunately for them, Şengün was still on the board. And Jalen, of course, went at 2nd overall. And now you're putting those 2 out with a true point guard and Fred VanVleet, and another key defender in Dylan Brooks. So you have more culture. Now there's a proven head coach in Ime Udoka. If those guys don't take a leap, and it looks like guys you allocated premium resources to aren't panning out, then yeah, there is a discussion that we're going to have. And by the way, next year is the extension summer potentially for Jalen and LP. So it's a critical inflection point. They're very incentivized to play well this year. If they don't, then yeah, that's the kind of thing that can force, some hard conversations. In terms of the results-based outcomes, I'm not there yet. I agree. There's still a little bit more time that I would give with these core 6, and specifically those 2 guys from 2021 that are hitting a key inflection point within their careers. There's no more excuses. You've got the point guard, you've got the head coach. I think you let this season play out, and then, review the landscape by the time we get to next April and May.
Yeah, I think ultimately it's about being balanced, right? You apply the same logic. You apply a results-based analysis for the KPK situation. Fair enough. Now let's apply the same logic to what is the cycle of rebuilding that Rafaelson went through. It's those 3 years, and now this is the year where everything is defined, where we judge
Hmm.
where we are at a point where these guys are supposed to start producing. Let's see how that goes. And you could make the argument that he should be given longer because a rebuild, you know, there are scenarios where maybe the 2021 draft is didn't go well and those guys don't pan out, but when the 2022 and 2023 drafts turn out to be genius. Yeah, and if in a scenario where Amen Thompson and Jabari Smith turn out to be superstars, you may regret the fact that you fired Rafaelson at the end of this year because this year didn't go well. But that's not even the point that I'm making. The point that
Well,
I'm making,
and you can say that, the Kevin Porter Jr. situation could accelerate that timetable if things go poorly, and then you factor in the rebuild being more delayed than you expect with this Kevin Porter Jr. storyline and other misses, then yeah, that could, perhaps move up your schedule a bit more than you would if there wasn't the KPJ cloud hanging over the rebuild to this point. So it could accelerate the timetable. I think what you're saying, and I'm in agreement with you on, it's not in a vacuum so egregious that you have to and should act right now. It's not to that level.
yeah, as I said, unless someone makes a franchise-altering mistake, they shouldn't be fired before they get to do their job. As long as they provide, they make good moves to some extent. I mean, Rocco trade was still great. Christian Wood trade was still great. Um, I mean, the drafting outside of the top 10 has been great as well. So I think because of that, he has earned himself enough leeway to at least be able to see out 1 year of his team trying to compete with a good head coach that he picked, with a team with the free agency and the draft picks finally, having some expectations on them, right? I think it makes sense to wait for the next year. That being said,
At least, but yeah.
yeah, at least I'm not saying that the KPJ situation isn't basically Stone shooting himself in the foot a little bit. It does decrease the ability of the team going into this year. I tweeted about it. I called it a little bit of a handicap, right?
Yeah.
If he didn't make the bet on KPJ, he would likely have a player there instead. That would play a certain role in the team. Team would be better for it than it is with KPJ's contract without KPJ playing, which is basically the worst case scenario. Yes, it is a mistake, just like he has made other mistakes, in my opinion. Dylan Brooks is paid too much. That's a mistake, in my opinion. The Tai Washington, Garuba, Christopher trades were a mistake. But once again, they are mistakes egregious enough for you to fire people on the spot, and you have to see how those mistakes versus the good moves that they made, how those pan
No.
out. And we will get to see that this season. Even although not having KPJ and the KPJ saga is a handicap, that doesn't mean that it is impossible that the team performs anyways or performs better. Who knows what would have happened with KPJ, right? So you have to wait, see how things pan out, and make your decision at the end of the year. It makes no sense to make a change now. I mean, the offseason has just ended, right? What are you going? Do you think Stone is going to make or break the team based on from now until the deadline? Because that's basically what you're switching out if you choose to fire him now versus potentially making that decision at the end of the season. So it just, I think, asking for him to be let go now is agenda driven. It's overreactionary, which is easy to do with the social media age, and I think cooler heads will prevail within the Rockets front office, and they'll at least wait and see what this team that
Yeah.
Rafaelson has built uh, turns out to be, because that's when you can judge someone. I mean, you can't ask someone, I don't know, to build you a plane and then fire them halfway through because you didn't like how the paint job looked. You have to wait until the plane flies and see if the plane flies well, then you keep them. If the plane
Yeah.
doesn't and it crashes, that's when you fire them. It's as I said, unless there is some catastrophic mistake, you have to see out the cycle.
Yeah. And I think back to the episode we did back in January, grading his first 2+ years as GM, and the conclusion we came to at the very end was, look, there's a lot of bad GMs out there. You absolutely can do worse. And so you have to be careful with this. You can't, I'm not saying that you can't do better, but you also don't need to go into this situation in a reckless manner, which I think it would be to just abruptly change course on the fly right before the season based on this. I think that's a little extreme. If you eventually go down this path, it needs to be measured. There needs to be a strategic plan for how you upgrade. Because his track record, while not perfect, there are definitely a number of GMs that have done worse because there are some clear positives for Rafael. And so again, I'm not saying he's the world's best GM. I'm not saying you can't do better. No, you can absolutely make a case. I'm just saying that you need to be sort of measured and beyond just the fairness angle of giving him this season to see how some of his young prospects develop. I also just think it's prudent from an organizational perspective because making a move now would largely be one based on panic and emotion. And I think if you're going to make a change that drastic to your basketball operations, it needs to be more strategic. So beyond just getting more data, it also gives you more time to sort of survey the landscape and think internally, okay, what are our other options? What are other paths that we could consider, put out some feelers behind the scenes. And because, yeah, there's a lot to weigh. It is not a given that you would improve from Rafael Stone. There are definitely worse GMs, and that's something you have to consider. Now, one caveat I want to throw out there for all the talk, and I think we're largely in agreement that the investment and resources they put into the KPJ project the last couple of years, it's not insignificant, but it's not catastrophic. It's not like they gave just a franchise crippling amount of be it money or reps. I do think they accounted for the risk and the project nature of basically the KPJ wildcard. That's the best way I think you can frame his initial acquisition in early 2021. It wasn't egregious enough to where you say, because it played out this way, that it's just so bad that action has to be taken. There is one potential scenario, but I think it goes back into your, message board fodder theory. And I think, giving more credence to substantive reports. I have seen speculation that KPJ's baggage at USC, where Evan Mobley's dad was an assistant coach, could have been a factor in the Rockets drafting Jalen Green ahead of Evan Mobley. Mobley was number 2 in the eyes of a lot of people around the NBA in that 2021 class. And to this point, Evan has been the better player relative to Jalen. Now, again, there's circumstances. He's got a much more simplified role in Cleveland. It's a better team around him. And I still have a lot of faith personally in Jalen, especially this year, that he's going to take the leap. But ultimately, if Mobley turns out to be a better player, and to this point, I know there's circumstances, but he has been, and you let the KPJ project total wild card influence what you did with the number 2 overall pick in the draft, then that's really, really bad. But I just personally don't believe it because, again, that's from what I've seen speculation. I have not seen hard reporting from anyone that alleges the Rockets made the number 2 pick in 2021 for any reason other than they truly believed in Jalen Green. And again, it's just important to note the difference between social media fodder and gossip versus credible reporting. If that had happened, then yeah, it's really bad. But again, there's just a lot of gossip and turning, for the sake of clicks, just fun internet discussions into being more than they are. It reminds me a lot of when, this June, when there were constant reports that, oh, because the Rockets are going after a former all-star point guard, as initially was believed to be James Harden, it turned out to be Fred VanVleet, that the Rockets might not take Amin Thompson because why would you draft a rookie point guard if you're going to get a veteran? And I said throughout the process, and ultimately I was right, there is no way in hell you would let an asset as premium as the number 4 overall pick and a strong first round, a guy who's 19 years old, and if all things pans out, could be a key player for your franchise for the next 15 years, be determined by a stopgap, which is what James Harden or ultimately Fred VanVleet were and probably are. They are not the foundation of your contender, what we hope is a contender 3 to 5 years down the line. And it would have been silly for the Rockets, and fortunately they did not, to factor that into their thinking with what they're going to do with number 4 overall pick. Even if there's a position overlap, whatever, you deal with that later. And I think it's very similar in this case in that, yeah, because KPJ was something of, don't want to say a cornerstone, but one of the most promising prospects the Rockets had at the time. I mean, they were really bad in the first half of 2021 before the draft. then yeah, there's people that are going to speculate, okay, how does, you know, whoever they hypothetically draft fit in with, I guess, KPJ and KJ Martin, who are probably the two best prospects they had at the time. But ultimately, neither of those guys were anywhere close to enough where you should factor their fit in with an asset as high as number 2 overall. So I just want to address that. If that happened, if credible reporting comes out that the Rockets passed on Evan Mobley for the sake of tension between the Mobley camp and KPJ based on knowing his baggage at USC, then yeah, that'd be really, really bad if you let your number 2 overall pick be influenced by a guy who's a project. I just personally do not believe that at all. I think they were all in on Jalen Green, the prospect. I think they still are, and hopefully he works out. If he doesn't, then yeah, you can hold it against Rafael, but I don't think KPJ factored into that analysis. I think it was just about Jalen, the basketball player, and time will tell if he's right. This year will be a big year for that. The final thing I want to say about KPJ and the whole culture element as it pertains to Rafael Stone, and not just Rafael, but Tillman Fertitta as the owner has some responsibility as well. And there's plenty of people the last 3 years have been miserable that already do not like Rafael and or Tillman, and this is sort of easy ammo to advance some of those agendas. But I would be very careful in ascribing too much. Again, it's very easy to sort of boogeyman this situation because at least from the circles that I run in on social media and blogs, I would say the fan base, there were basically 3 factions. There were about 10 or 15% that were out on KPJ at all cost. They were in the Chris Mannix camp of, basically as soon as that New Year's Day incident 2022, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for some of those folks and said, you know what, I don't believe in him. He's not going to be one of the guys who takes advantage of his second chance. I don't think anyone's saying that you shouldn't give second chances, but for some, that incident with John Lucas and storming out of the arena at halftime was a point in which they said this is not going to end well. And ultimately it didn't. And so if you were in the camp that said then, you know what, cut him, waive him, the Chris Mannix line, you were right. You can have the victory lap. Dave Hardesty put that out after everything broke that Chris Mannix was right. He was. Kudos to him. And I objected with him at the time, but Chris Mannix was right. And I would say there were about 10 to 15%, at least from my interactions, of Rockets fans who felt the same way. And those people should take a victory lap. That's fair. Now, on the flip side, there's about 10 to 15% of people that were just unashamed KPJ homers that, believed that everything was basically fake news and that he was going to be a core piece to the future just because, quite frankly, they wanted him to be. And, those people were clearly silly. Don't want to name names, but certainly some of that was overdone. However, I think there's sort of a middle ground that you and I both belong to. And in my opinion, it was a clear majority. I'd say probably 60, 70% of the fan base that were okay with KPJ, recognized the talent, but wanted appropriate risk mitigations. And ultimately, that's what the Rockets did with the contract and getting the year-to-year optionality, specifically after the first year of that extension. That's why I do sort of disagree with some of the doubling down framing. If in October, when the Rockets gave KPJ what amounted to a 1-year, $16 million extension, that's what it is now. If you didn't want KPJ extended at all, if you were hell-bent on sending him to restricted free agency and potentially, trading him or losing him for no compensation, if you were in the camp then that he was more trouble than he's worth, that it wasn't going to be worthwhile, then kudos to you. That's the Chris Mannix camp. Those people got it right. But I also think there's some people that were in the middle ground that, because they're already frustrated with a number of things with the Rockets, again, this rebuild has not been pretty, that are sort of using hindsight being 2020 to rewrite history a little bit. I don't necessarily agree that the Rockets doubled down on KPJ with that extension unless you were willing to lose him for no compensation, unless you were ultimately wanting him off the team, period. And if you were, that's fine. But I just don't think, at least from my interactions, that that's where the majority of the fan base was. Because I want to illustrate what the path would have been had you not given him that extension. So, to go back, both sides gave a little bit in that negotiation. And at the time, most of the reviews, both nationally and locally, of that KPJ extension were favorable. Here's the dynamic. The non-taxpayer MLE, which most NBA teams have, was going to be about $13 million in annual value based on the new CBA. The Rockets paid a bit more than that to get an option year after year one to help mitigate the risk because of his baggage. If you wanted to get KPJ at something closer to the MLE, then I don't know why he signs that extension at all. He just takes it to free agency because that type of money is there and probably for more years than one, at least a partial guarantee on the second year. Nobody's going to give KPJ a 4-year deal. Let's not get crazy, but play it out till July 2023. It'd been a season and a half since there were any known incidents. He was one of the best catch and shoot players in the league, averaged an efficient 19, 6 and 6, and true shooting percentage since about December 15th was about 60. There was a market for KPJ if he had become a free agent. So the Rockets paid a little bit more than that to get the option on year one. And then KPJ took that deal for the peace of mind of getting that guaranteed money 9 months early. Both sides compromised a little bit. And again, most of the reviews were fairly favorable at the time. Now, I will acknowledge the extensions come under a little bit more scrutiny this offseason because the Rockets had the trade that sent out Usman Garuba and Ty Washington for extra cap space for Brook Lopez. They didn't even end up needing. And it is true that if you hadn't given KPJ the extension, his cap hold entering what would have been restricted free agency would have been about $10 million. And the delta between that figure and the $16 million on his current extension, about $6 million, that was basically the Usman and Ty deals. But I think that's a little bit overplayed, and we've discussed that in recent episodes. By now, it's clear that no NBA team wanted those players on a legitimate NBA contract. They went unclaimed. Multiple teams tried to trade them and couldn't. They're now on two-way deals, which are the NBA equivalent of minor league contracts. Again, any team could have traded for them or claimed them. They didn't. I don't think that's a huge loss, and I don't think that's something that you should factor in all that heavily into your analysis of this. And there was no real place for them to play in the rotation this year, as we've covered before, as far as the scenario of what happens if you keep them with the Rockets. More importantly, though, in terms of the contract that would have happened had KPJ become a restricted free agent, there's a couple of very important pieces of context here. Again, my opinion, based on the fact there hadn't been any known issues in a year and a half, he's a talented and versatile 23-year-old coming off an efficient season. I think he gets, if not 2 years, at least a year and a partial guarantee. At least 2 years and I'd say like 20 million guaranteed and probably more than that overall. But again, beyond that being a bit more sort of measured with the options because of the obvious baggage risk. But so many teams have the mid-level exception. He was going to get more money, in my opinion, or worst case in the ballpark. He was not going to get dramatically less than 16 million coming off what he's done the last 2 seasons and his age and not having any known incidents. I'm sorry, that just was not going to happen. So if you would have, knowing what we know now, if you had waited until restricted free agency, the odds are you'd be in an even worse place because even if it's a slightly lower average annual value, all that matters now that his NBA career is probably over is the total deal value. And so the 16 million that you're having to eat, my guess is he gets more guaranteed money than that if he enters restricted free agency. And KPJ probably knew that too. I think he just took the deal early for the peace of mind. And so from a Rocket standpoint, average annual value doesn't even matter in a situation like this. It's just the total guaranteed money period that the Rockets or some other team is potentially on the hook for now that he's just completely toast as an NBA player. And who knows if he'll even be a free man. I mean, there's a world where he absolutely goes to jail for this. Time will tell as far as the legal case. And so in that scenario, if you play it out to restricted free agency, you're in an even worse spot. There's another area where you're in a worse spot, and the Rockets didn't know this at the time, but is a results-driven business, and so you factor it into the analysis. If the Rockets had given him a contract in restricted free agency, he would not be trade eligible until December 15th. And I think that's far too long for the Rockets to wait. This scenario where they trade him, I do think politically he needs to be off any NBA team's roster by the time games actually start playing. I don't think that's politically tenable at all. And if you had given him a contract this summer, he wasn't going to be trade eligible at all. And so you'd almost certainly just have to waive him as opposed to being able to explore trade options at all. Now, again, that's not something that I think Rafael planned for. But at the same time, like the results are a factor. It is a results-driven business. And so when we're talking about the total cost, then yes, this alternative scenario, in my opinion, actually may have been worse. The one caveat, if you were truly okay losing Kevin Porter Jr. for no compensation and basically using his salary slot in this offseason that you had all that money on somebody else, if you wanted out of the Kevin Porter Jr. business altogether, if you were in the hardline Chris Mannix camp, then congratulations, you got it right. Hat tip to you. And there are some that were in that boat. But if you were in what I believe the majority were, which is the middle ground, the idea of I'm interested in gambling on his talent, especially in a rebuild, but I want some mitigations. Ultimately, that's what the Rockets did. And I don't think the mitigations would have been all that much better had they waited until restricted free agency. In my opinion, it probably would have ended up worse. That's just my opinion. So at the end of the day, I think there's a little bit of revisionist history with going back in time and saying that the extension was doubling down. No, it was their version of risk mitigation. And in some ways, it actually may have mitigated the risk relative to re-signing him as a restricted free agent. Again, the one caveat being, unless you're proposing letting him go altogether. But hindsight's 2020 now. The question I would ask, was that your opinion at the time? If it was, hat tip. If not, then you made a mistake, and it's possible that NBA GMs will as well. And that's the very last point I want to make on this. Some will hear all that and say that's a fair argument in theory, but Rafael Stone is the GM and Tillman Fertitta is the owner. These guys have more knowledge than we do. So even if fans didn't want out of the KPJ business and were okay taking the gamble, then the Rockets should have known better because he's their employee. And my response to that would be, this is not a basketball issue. You can say in regards to, certain dynamics that they have information to in terms of their data analytics, what happens on the practice court. Yeah, they have more information than us. In terms of something like this that happens behind closed doors, they don't have cameras on this guy's driveway or inside his bedroom. There's some things that are private. And even one of the, prestigious organizations that I referenced earlier, teams like the Spurs and the Heat, look, they just had the Josh Primo situation a year or so ago. Are we going to act like that Greg Popovich and R.C. Buford and Peter Holt don't know what they're doing? You can even go back to the early 1990s. Vernon Maxwell punched a guy in the stands with the Rockets in the 90s. And of course, they recovered to win a championship with him. And then he ended up actually leaving the team at the start of the playoffs before the second championship in 1995. Are we going to act like Rudy Tomjanovich didn't know what he was doing in terms of building a culture? There is an NBA history of giving second chances. When you give second chances, sometimes they're going to work out. John Lucas is an example of a guy who got the chance and redeemed himself and then some and has learned from it. And some don't. Now, that's not to say you minimize it. No, you absolutely keep it in mind. It is a black mark. It is something that sort of goes in the file, and you hope that they learn from it. But in terms of the alleged lack of institutional control, if you will, I would not go there based on one player, a case study that is basically one example. Now, if this happens again, then yeah, if similar things happen with other guys, then yeah, it absolutely is fair to question, be it the GM, the coach, the owner, are the Rockets missing red flags? Are they doing something in terms of their culture that is just not recognizing these problems? If it happens repeatedly, then sure. But there are plenty of examples, even with good teams and well-run organizations, of guys who, on personal issues, because again, so much of this happens behind closed doors. It's not like you're watching this every day on the basketball court and collecting data. There are going to be, unfortunately, some isolated incidents. And so I guess the word I would go back to is nuance. This is not meant to be a blanket excuse for Rafael Stone. It absolutely should go into his file, if you will. And if he makes similar mistakes in the future, then yeah, you can and probably should make or ask questions regarding the culture and are they just not caring enough of the human angles. But based on one man, I'm not willing to go to that extreme just yet. I would say it's something you should learn from. It's something that you should keep in your memory bank. But to go back to what you were saying as far as just the basketball merits, I think it's something that while a black mark for Rafael, probably for Tillman, for the whole organization, I don't think it's catastrophic to the point where you make a panic move now. I think you keep it in the back of your mind. If it's repeated, then sure, it could be the impetus for a move down the line. But I just don't think in isolation that this is so bad that it prompts the move. I guess that's the way I would sum all of this up.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's you can hold people accountable because it is somewhat their responsibility to make the correct bets if you're being results based, as I said before. But then again, as far as we know from reputable sources and not random guys in forums, the Rockets took a shot on a guy that didn't work out. They had faith in him. Obviously, they knew more than we do, but to what extent we won't know until someone like Woke, Shams, maybe Tim McMahon, guys like that, publish a story on it. I wanted to believe in KPJ personally before I found out what this would happen. Right? He seemed like a guy who had who had a traumatic upbringing that was trying to make something of himself. They had some mental health issues, but he was trying to work through them. And I sympathized with that, and I was rooting for him to succeed. Obviously, it turned out that he is an actual monster, right? And
Certainly appears that way. Yeah.
yeah, based on the reporting we have today.
An actual criminal complaint. Yeah.
So, you know, they were wrong. But the only thing that could change my perception of the Rockets as an organization would be if a report came out that they knew that abuse
Right.
was going on throughout their relationship while he was with the Rockets and they did
Yeah.
nothing about it.
Yeah.
That would be something that
Yeah, and I will say from my conversations, they were, people have said this week there were warning signs. Yeah, there were. The Rockets did not turn a blind eye to this. They said consistently throughout the 2.5 years that he was here, they were aware of the anger issue, that it was very real. It was told to me multiple times. It wasn't like they were turning a blind eye. It's that they were trusting the process of trying to improve that. He was going to therapy. He was working very intensely with John Lucas. And it's funny, when you see all this stuff about, oh, there's these warning signs. Well, we don't want to just say, well, because there's these warning signs to just not give people second chances. In this case, we're talking about, his work with John Lucas. John Lucas is the quintessential example. When you go back to his upbringing in the 80s, and that's why he tries to work with so many troubled athletes now, of a guy who did a lot of bad things and ultimately was able to learn from his mistakes, adapted his behavior, and became, a change agent for good within sports and helping so many young athletes move past some of their demons and get to a better place mentally when it comes to their ability, not just to be productive on the court, but just to be productive people in general and live a healthy life. John Lucas has been immense. And so when we talk about him in this story, because obviously, he had not just the incident with KPJ on January 1st, 2022, but he's been sort of a mentor this whole time. Yeah, the Rockets took it seriously. That's why they had Lucas working with him. That was a huge part of their plan when they brought him in early 2021. That's why, Austin Rivers mentioned this week that when the Rockets initially acquired him from Cleveland, they were wondering about what they should do because the talent was there, but they recognized the risk and they tried to, it wasn't like they just said, there's nothing to see here, cover your eyes and ears and all those memes. No, they took it seriously. It's just, unfortunately, in this case, those steps weren't enough. And he couldn't put those demons behind it. That doesn't mean that whenever there's warning signs in the future, that it's an automatic no-go. Again, John Lucas is the perfect example. There were for sure warning signs with John Lucas, and he ended up being just a transcendent figure, not just as a player and a coach, but as a man and what he's done for so many people within the athletic community. So I think it's just important to note that there were warning signs, absolutely, but that in and of itself, I don't think is necessarily disqualifying. There's plenty of people that have taken advantage of second chances, and the Rockets were taking steps to make sure that he was trying to improve himself and working on his problems. And again, there hadn't been any issues, at least not to my knowledge, since that incident on New Year's Day 2022. That was a clear inflection point. He was suspended after that. They had some hard conversations. And, while there were other things, we can point to the strip club incident. That was a month after he started playing in early 2021. There was the DJ incident that Jackson Gatlin has reported, which to my understanding was also in 2021. That incident in early 2022 was sort of an inflection point. And at that point, yeah, you had to take it more seriously. And at least to their knowledge, for the season and a half that took place since January 1st, 2022, there had been progress. There had been growth. While not perfect, the incidents were dramatically reduced. There wasn't any major storyline. Again, that's part of why I think he would have gotten at least maybe a year and a half of guaranteed money. It's something close to the mid-level exception, which nearly every team has. It's not that the Rockets didn't take it seriously. It's just in this case, all the help they tried to give just apparently didn't work out. And sometimes it's just going to be that way. And if it continues to happen, then sure, it's a black mark on the leadership of the organization. But in one case, not necessarily. Sometimes the second chances work out, sometimes they don't. This one doesn't. You file it away, you don't ignore it, you keep it in mind. But as long as this is the one example, then to me, it's not something that's automatically disqualifying for anyone simply based on how this turned out.
Yeah, I'm with you. With the information we have right now,
Sure.
from reputable sources, what I have to say is, from a basketball standpoint, it was a missed bet. From a human standpoint, I can tell you that I wouldn't have made the same bet with what we know right now.
Mhm.
Because, with what was public knowledge, I believed in KPJ the talent, and I thought maybe he could work through his issues, but he clearly couldn't. And until reliable information comes out that says that the Rockets knew otherwise, I'm not going to blame them for taking that chance.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap things right here. We've covered so many angles of this: the basketball side, the team building side, now the personal side. I suppose the organizational culture. We've attacked this from all angles, and ultimately, that's what I wanted to do, to give it a little bit of space before doing so. Paulo, you had some things going on last week, so that's why I tried to keep the shows a bit short. Then, not just for the sake of waiting for your return. That's part of it, but also to give a little bit of space as well. Now that this is basically a week and a half old, I think it's a point in which I think people are more capable of sort of taking a step back and looking at sort of the bigger picture, how we got here, what lessons are to be taken away, and hopefully, look back on this with a bit more nuance as opposed to some of the panic and emotion that happens in the immediate aftermath of a tragic situation like this one. Anyway, this can be our KPJ episode, and this can do it until he's ultimately traded or released. And of course, at that point, we'll react in the coming days or weeks whenever that happens and tell you our perspective on what the Rockets got or didn't get and what the takeaways from the transaction are and what it means for the team. And then, of course, around the same time frame, little over 2 weeks or a little under 2 weeks away, excuse me, we have media day on Monday the 2nd, and then the start of training camp on Tuesday the 3rd. So we're going to have a lot more content in the very near future. Just stay tuned. But for one show, we've had enough discussion, and so we'll wrap it right here. As I mentioned leading off the show, if you want to follow me or Paulo in the interim before our next episode, the best place to do it is on Twitter or X. I'm on there at Ben DuBose. Paulo is on there at Paulo Alves NBA. And if you follow the show on Twitter, the Logger Line, and go to the link tree in the bio, that's where you can find content and information from all our friends, partners, sponsors, Carbach Brewing, where this show is put on. Of course, the brand comes from their beer, Clutch Lager, developed in collaboration with the Rockets. You can find the link to Carbach Brewing's website. You can find the link to Sports Talk 790, who we produce this show with support from. You can go to sports790.com through the link on our Logger Line link tree. You can also hit up Rockets Wire. That's the USA Today affiliate covering the Rockets, where I write daily news stories. All of that is available if you go to the Logger Line on Twitter and hit up that link tree. That's how you can support our friends, partners, and sponsors. And if you show some love to them, I would appreciate it. We would also appreciate it, of course, if you go to Apple, Google, Spotify, your distributor of choice, subscribe to the show if you aren't already, leave a positive review. We would certainly appreciate that. And the links to get to the distributors are available through the link tree as well. All right, with those plugs complete, I will adjourn. Again, for Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening. And please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.